Good evening, everyone. My name is Christy Vallier, and I'm an assistant professor of architecture and the chair of this year's Baumer lecture series entitled Doubling. It is my pleasure to introduce Todd Gannon for tonight's lecture entitled Theory and Design in the Last Machine Age. Todd is an architect, writer, and curator currently based in Los Angeles, although he is very familiar with the Knowlton School of Architecture. He received his undergraduate and graduate degrees from this program and taught here for a handful of years before attending UCLA, where he received his PhD. In 2008, he joined the faculty of SCI-Arc, where he teaches history, theory, and design studios. He serves as the graduate thesis research advisor and coordinates the cultural studies curriculum. Gannon's research focuses on the history and theory of late 20th century and contemporary architecture. I hope most of you were able to join the panel discussion that was moderated by Todd this afternoon to mark the recently published In Suburbia Ego, a descriptive look at Jose Ubini's Miller House. I'd like to note that there will be a book selling and signing immediately following the lecture this evening. Todd was the editor of this book, in addition to an impressive amount of other publications, including The Light Construction Reader in 2002, and monographs on the work of Morphosis, Bernard Schumi, UN Studio, Stephen Hall, Max Goggin and Meryl Elam, Zaha Hadid, and Peter Eisenman. In collaboration with Iwan Branda and Andrew Zago, Gannon curated the 2013 exhibition A Confederacy of Heretics at SCI-Arc's gallery, which examines the legacy of Tom May's 1979 architecture gallery in Venice, California. It is challenging to introduce someone when so many people in this room know him so well. In fact, until last year, I only knew Todd through stories and tales. These stories described a colleague that was earnest, funny, and critical of architecture's trajectory. And any one of these qualities would make him interesting. It seemed unfair that he had it all. Could it be true? Well, upon meeting him, I can say that it is. He is generous with his knowledge, and the references run deep. There is indeed much to learn. He has left a legacy here at this school and continues to have a significant impact on the discipline and the institutions that he engages. Most strikingly, he is one of the few of his generation that has, on multiple occasions, attempted to identify contemporary movements in architecture, which he admittedly says is tricky business. I look forward to the stories tonight. Please help me welcome Todd Gannon.
I don't know, wait till whatever, 2026 to come back, but we'll see. Reyner Banham, who I wrote a dissertation on at UCLA a couple of years ago, and I hope it's about to become a book. I think I find out for sure next week. So fingers crossed. And specifically, I want to look at Banham's late work on high tech, which is something that doesn't get a ton of attention. In his legacy, I don't think. Now, it's weird. I was looking at this just the other day, and I realized that Banham actually died on March 19th, 1988. I have no idea. I find it to be incredibly creepy. So I thought I would share that, so you can find it creepy too. So anyway, Banham, I assume, is somebody that you are all somewhat familiar with. I would hope that many of you have read at least parts or hopefully all of some of his famous books like Theory and Design of the First Machine Age, or his book on Los Angeles, or The Architecture of the Well-Founded Environment. I think we hopefully are familiar with his love of Knowlton, folding bicycles, and the desert, and cowboy hats. I think we probably, these are all the things that I expect you to know so you can follow the lecture. You know, Banham was somebody who was famously impatient with the establishment of architecture, and he quite famously vocalized his preference for advanced technology unencumbered by the stale disciplinary conventions. And so stuff like this he thought was really cool. That looks like Banham over on the side, but Tony Vidler told me not long ago that it wasn't Banham, so I have to change the dissertation. I really don't know. But less well known is Banham's late work on high tech. So toward the end of his life, where I think most of the Banham scholarship really concentrates on his anti-establishment attitudes, on his love of weirdo things that seem not to fit very well into the discipline, like Los Angeles or the desert. But at the end of his life, it turns out he was he was writing a lot of articles on high tech, and practitioners like Richard Rogers, Norman Foster, Renzo Piano. He was teaching a course on high tech at UC Santa Cruz, and he was, when he died, in negotiations with a publisher to produce a book on high tech called Making Architecture the Paradoxes of High Tech. I realize I'm going to say the word high tech a lot in this lecture, so it's going to start sounding smirky. I apologize. But so the work never got finished, and I wanted to kind of talk about it. I think it really changes the way that I look at Banham. He winds up a much more complicated character if you look at him through the lens of context. So I wanted to say just a little bit about how I came to this topic. It was an incredibly circuitous and long route. I had originally written my prospectus planning to write on Archigram, and specifically on the Archigram pamphlets, of which there were 9.5. And right after that prospectus was approved, they made the archive unavailable because they were digitizing it. So I had to scramble and figure out something else to do, which took a long time. At that time, I was also teaching quite a bit at SCI-Arc, at Otis College, at UCLA. I was practicing as well, and I noticed something that I found increasingly peculiar. And looking back, I think this maybe sounds a little bit naive, and I'm interested to hear whether you think so or not. But I noticed that among my colleagues, among my students, among people that I looked up to, there was a tendency to do work, almost a kind of knee-jerk position, to produce work that were kind of collisions or mashups, or sort of intentionally juxtapositional compositions. So things like Eric Moss's pterodactyl, this thing kind of crashing to the top of a parking garage, or Hernan's thing gobbling the side of a unsuspecting piece of urban fabric. And then I realized here at Ohio State, this was a similar trend. So we talked a lot about the Miller House earlier, but Jose's Z House, I think, very much conforms to this attitude I was looking at. Rob's house, where I stayed last night, is, first of all, fantastic, and you should all pay closer attention to this thing, but also very much fits in this kind of tendency. The one piece of my own work, and I apologize for these horrific sketchup renderings, but I would do that. in my own work. And so I started figuring, like, where did this come from? Where did this start? And again, this is not the way to start a dissertation. Don't do this. It takes a long time. It takes everyone uncomfortable. But I started to think about this, and I realized, throughout history you can find all kinds of examples. And particularly in things like English Gothic, the kind of aggregated pile up of these isolated elements of Canterbury, which Nicholas Pevsner, who was Banham's thesis advisor, was very aptly pointed out was a very different attitude to the integrated compositions that we find in French. Pevsner's dosed kind of votes of the probability as well. You could see it in some. These are basically just random examples, so I don't need to be giving an exhaustive history. I can already see Doug and Jackie; they know more and better ones. But something like San Lorenzo and Miranda, which is a kind of liturgical introduction. This one thing shoved inside another, or Alexander Thompson, who I don't know if you guys know the edition that was put on this thing. It seems very much in keeping with the original composition. It's like a block of office. Nobody thinks that's fun. The streak continues. But stuff like this, I was very interested in. I was kind of looking at it, and then I found something funny when you start looking at modernism. At least most Orthodox modernism, it becomes very hard to find examples of works that operate this way. And so there are a handful of weird examples, things like Le Corbusier's sort of surrealist adoration at the Stegway apartment, or Lubetkin's funny columns at High Point. But in general, the earliest one that I was able to find so far is the Eleanor Raymond's Cambridge School of Architecture in Cambridge. She was a protege of Walter Gropius. This was the women's counterpart to the GSD in the 1920s. But so here you see this kind of Bauhaus and wing just kind of jammed into an otherwise conventional stick frame building. So this is the oldest modern one that I've found. But for the most part, what I found was, in spite of a lot of the rhetoric and my own expectations, I found that most modernist works seemed much more easily to fit into a story that had class movements, that had a kind of. So whether we look at the Corbusier comparing cars to temples and then comparing his own buildings to cars, or Colin Rowe's very famous examples of comparing Corbusier to Palladio, or Corbusier comparing himself to Vitruvius, there seemed to be, through not just the Corbusier, but through much of the architecture at the beginning of the 20th century in the modernist idiom, not much of that mashup attitude. And I found that to be curious. And I realized it really wasn't until after World War II that you started to see it. And so it's something that you can't really see it in this drawing, I apologize. But trust me, the stuff on the back of this frame house is very different from the stuff that was there before by Luke Kahn. Or Philip Johnson's 1951 addition to the Henry Ford House on Long Island, which puts this kind of groovy, that thing next to that thing, which is getting closer to the kind of stuff I was into. Or something like Coventry Cathedral by Basil Spence, which, as you may know, the original cathedral was bombed during World War II, and the addition was just kind of jammed onto the roof. And so this was something, by the way, that was pushed by Pevsner very hard. And this puts us in proximity to somebody like Archigram, who I have been working on. So this kind of jumbly, aggressively being in pursuit of juxtaposition attitude that this, it started kind of getting the wheels turning a little bit. And so in looking at Archigram, they're quite vocal, it turns out, about making clear their impatience with classical precedents and disciplinary conventions of that sort, and looking at things like this, like the lunar lander, where the orbiter has one job to do, and it has one visual language that comes out of it. The lunar lander has a very different job to do, and it has a very different visual language. And I'm really looking at these as visual languages. The function is in there, but it's really the making a point of the piece of being with it. And then just jamming the two together. And so this was something that the Archigram characters really like to talk about. They also like stuff like this. That you could take a very small, fairly inexpensive piece of technology, jam it onto an otherwise normative thing, and get a radically different set of possibilities. It was something that not just could you make the boat go faster and not have to row anymore. One of David Green's favorite images is the outboard rock, or the possibility of a water skiing elephant. These sort of clip-on gadgets became a way to produce other opportunities. This was the Peter Cook scheme for Sawtell Boulevard in Los Angeles, where the 405 and the 10 come together. But I don't expect you to talk about this in LA, I do. But this was the kind of thing, suddenly it was here. And when you look at this kind of work, what I found funny, well, if you look at this was really positioned at a time when the English architectural establishment, the kind of old school modernists of the previous generation of the Archigram characters, were doing stuff like this. The Festival of Britain, which I think was by the younger generation generally divided. Reyner, Banham, for instance, wrote this off in an article as flimsy and effeminate. And it really is kind of modernism on Prozac in a way. And I think Colin Rowe was the one that called it modern planning, or modern buildings with picturesque planning. But it was something that the Architectural Review was very much pushing. And the Architectural Review was where Banham worked. And Hertzberger was the editor-in-chief. And so, strangely enough, the review, the voice of the establishment, was pushing this kind of mashup attitude. And I found this to be like absolutely counter. But when you look at something like Townscape, which was developed in the review over several years, and finally put together in a book by Cullen in 1961, you see exactly those kind of juxtapositions of styles and materials and a kind of almost narrative sequence of experience that comes out of it. And what's interesting about that is that Banham, who I expected to be into this kind of clip-on stuff, hated all of this. All of his friends, Sterling, Cullen, the Smithsons, they all hated this stuff, like vehemently hated it. Wrote editorials like screaming and frothing his mouth about it. And instead, Banham at that time begins to get on board with Brutalism, which was so he writes 2 books on Brutalism, or an article and a book, so the article in 1955, the book in 66. And this was really a kind of stylistic category that he invented almost, or he didn't invent it, the Smithsons invented it, but it came almost entirely out of the Smithsons' work. And the flagship project, which Banham wrote about, so here's how Banham starts to plug into this story. The flagship project that Banham wrote about was the Hunstanton School. It was obviously Miesian ripoff, which, as the Smithsons would have it, and as Banham described it more correctly, Banham really loved this thing because of it, what he called its radical bloody-mindedness. It's that there was a certain ethical toughness about it, and what you see is what you get. There was no screwing around. He praised what he called its je m'en foutisme, which, ask your French teacher what that means. I don't give a fuck, but he was really interested in that kind of toughness. There was one problem with the building, though, and it still smacked of classicism. It still smacked of the traditional values that Banham saw as a kind of impediment to progress. So he developed some principles for this. And he comes up with a tripartite definition of what Brutalism is about. It had to be memorable as an image. You had to see it and it had to kind of hang together as a coherent thing. You used exposed structure. There was no veneers. You couldn't hide anything like these did at IIT. And materials were always in cast iron. No paint, no finishes. And that was where the kind of toughness came from. So he looked at the Smithsons as embodying that. He looked at somebody like Lou Kahn as being too ardent. Kahn's details were intolerably fussy and just too ardent. But the classicism problem remained. He spent a lot of time in that first essay trying to figure out how to get out from under it. And he ultimately did it by going to this book, the Sheffield University Extension by the Smithsons, a very famous drawing that I'm sure you've all seen. And here he saw something that didn't have this kind of classical, it didn't smell like classicism. It didn't have a kind of closed composition. It didn't have that kind of symmetrical courtyard that kind of snaked around the site in an interesting way. But the funny thing about it is that Banham completely ignored the fact that this was exactly one of those juxtapositions. When you look at the drawing, it's easy to forget, actually, that that black stuff was a big old Victorian building that this thing was stabbing with a spear. And so I scoured the Smithson archives. You cannot find a drawing that shows you the existing building. So I think the Smithsons were maybe even stacking the deck away from these kind of juxtapositions. But Banham, kind of skirts across it in his text. And when he writes his final, when he writes the book length analysis of this, he sees brutalism as ultimately failing. It was supposed to be an ethic, and it in fact evolved into what he called an aesthetic. And so when the Smithsons at the Economist building, incorporate this existing Google's Club, I think that was called, and Michael Karapetian's photographs, Jack. But Banham is, at this point, it's like they completely felt the way. They're exactly where Kahn is. I'm not interested anymore. And Banham moves on to something that was really my initial hint to why there was a connection between these put-together things and Banham. And that is his work, his invention of the category of clip-on architecture, which he does in the 1965 issue of Design Quarterly that came out of the Walker Center. And in that, he talked again about the sort of anti-classical tendencies that he was very interested in. He loved what he called the endless and indeterminate work of somebody like Herman at GM, where you just kind of keep adding bays. That it can go on forever, if you need more bays, you put more bays on. He saw this. This was what he liked about the Smithson's House of the Future. Like, he didn't talk about all the groovy outfits that they wore and the weird things, but it was all about you could just jam them all together in a row. But the article, and it's really totally worth reading. I think it remains the best historical presentation of Archigram out there. But the article is really about two practices, Cedric Price and the Archigram. And he begins with Price and spends a lot of time talking about the Fun Palace, which at that time looked like it was about to get built. And Banham really loved the Fun Palace. He was absolutely on board with this. He loved the way that Price was accommodating all these activities. So this was a scheme done for Joan Littlewood, who was a kind of big player in experimental theater. She imagined this kind of playhouse where you could just kind of go in, you could put on plays, you could do whatever you wanted to do, and the building could be rearranged to accommodate it. So you can see all the cranes and stuff that allow you to move the pieces around. The cyber efficient Gordon Pass got involved, and it was all worked out. They actually figured out how to do it. They just didn't have any money. But it looked like at the time, it looked like they were going to build it. They wound up not building it. Banham really loved the project, except for one thing. It didn't conform to that brutalist requirement of being memorable as an image. And so the famous quote from that text was Banham says, "We don't want form to follow function into oblivion." That if it's going to be architecture, it has to show you what it does. There has to be a visual component. There has to be a kind of communicative function. And he found that in the much less well technically worked out projects of Archigram, and basically in their drawings. So he saw like a total fantasy project like Plug-in City. There was no way you could do this. You would need a revolution and a total redistribution of capital to actually make this possible. He wasn't worried about any of that stuff. This was, in Banham's words, a plug-in city has to look like a plug-in city. It has to be able to communicate with you. And this was, in his words again, aesthetics had to lead, and this was aesthetics giving technology its marching orders. This sounded really weird to me. Thinking of Banham as the kind of common understanding is that he's the sort of tech guy and didn't care about aesthetics. And so to see him go at the aesthetics was weird. It was also weird to me when you look at this book, there's no clip-on image. If you look at something like Plug-in City, the aggregation is so fine that it actually hangs together quite easily as a unified image. And the juxtapositions that I expected to find in clip-on weren't there. A couple of years before, he didn't write principles in that book, but I needed principles because I wanted to make charts. And I found a couple of years earlier, Banham had written pretty convincing principles in another context where he was writing about similar things. And basically, he came up with the definition of this clip-on approach as having to do with a unity of effect, a convincing unity of effect, he called it, exposed surfaces. So not worrying about seeing the structure, but now seeing all the pipes and guts and wires, and the use of optical products. So you can see this as a development, a kind of hardening of those initial principles, but adjusted to avoid some of the traps, I guess, that we saw in Brutalism. And then another really strange thing happened as I was going. I don't want to make this sound too much like a detective story, but it really, like, I was kind of just trying to figure this out, and as I was reading through the material, like, none of my expectations were coming to place. And I don't know if this was because I was, like, not very smart and should have known better, or, but as I was talking to other people, everybody else had the same expectations as well. So, but what started to happen is not long after that book, a series of projects start to get built in London that seem to inhabit this principle. It's a very early example along these lines is the bathroom tower by Nicholas Grimshaw. There you see Grimshaw in the green tie showing off to Buckminster Fuller, who was apparently quite approving. But the project you see is it was here you can see the kind of plans a little bit better. It was an old kind of set of Victorian or kind of nondescript London urban fabric in the Paddington district. They wanted to turn it into dormitories. If you've ever stayed in a hostel in London, they never had enough bathrooms. That was the problem here. And so they just add this tower on the back like an outboard motor full of bathrooms. And so you see the way that the bathrooms work. They're these kind of plastic plug-in units that go into the central tower. There's a water tower on top. To build it, they had a crane on top. The spiral goes up. It's a really great section that you can't see, of course. But you see all the floor-to-floor heights are different. The spiral, they worked it out to kind of resolve them all. They're really kind of brilliant math. There was only a couple steps that they needed. And then they gutted the inside of the building, like removed its kind of, just scooped out all of its tradition, and filled it with these, kind of step section dorm rooms, and kind of like just plugged in little bits and pieces in all the nooks and crannies. So really interesting project. Obvious debts to Archigram. You see all the pieces, the spiral at the bottom, the plug-in units, the crane at the top. Grimshaw studied at the AA, he got it for his teacher. But to his credit, they had obvious, they had some help from Buckminster Fuller, who had done a very similar scheme in 1929. This is a fantastically cool scheme. You should all look at. The idea was you prefabricate the tower, you bring it to the site in a blimp. So you fly along in a blimp. I took this slide out because I thought it would take too long. I'm telling the story anyway. But the blimp comes along, you drop a bomb. That leaves a big crater. And then you drop the tower into the crater, and then you fill in the dirt around it, and then the blimp flies away, done. And Archigram did exactly this for the Instant City, in the same comic strip that Fuller illustrated this with. Archigram uses the same one. So, a funny little aside. Curiously, Banham does not write about this project at all, not one word. Banham, throughout his career, was a totally prolific writer. It makes you feel deeply inferior with the amount of text he was able to produce. And he wrote about everything that came along except that project. He almost never wrote about Nicholas Hawksmoor or Nick Grimshaw. I think because he just didn't like the guy. But the next kind of example of the clip-on genealogy that I'm tracing here comes from Richard and Sue Rogers. And this was the initial drawing that was done by Jakob when he was a very young practitioner working in Rogers' office. It's my favorite drawing of the whole thing. And because it had exactly the kind of stuff I wanted to see, just a totally rash, clipped together of unrelated things. I like the cord, I like the theme. It came out of, it actually got built, it came out of Rogers' interest in zip-up enclosures that he was trying to do, and they simply proposed to add one to the roof of the building to add an additional floor for Rogers' practice, basically, within the DRU. And you see, so it had to get kind of mellowed out a little bit to be turned into a building. But still kind of great, the sort of asymmetrical water tower. I really like the syncopation of the rhythm between the panels up above and the colonnades below. They had an incredibly hard time with the city with city approvals, that so the plastic was out, and then the asymmetries were out, and what finally got built was this. Still pretty good, but like a far cry from that. And here again, Banham doesn't write anything, but I did find one review, an unsigned review in a different magazine that sure sounds like that, where he's kind of carefully complimentary, but still sort of avoiding the topic, which I found was quite weird. Not long after that, the Elevated Training Center is completed. Banham did write about this. This is a building that I think we hopefully we're all very familiar with this big thing. We remember Doug's reading of this is kind of break it in half and then reform the little bits and pieces into this little four square there. The part that gets less attention is the renovation of the existing building that's on the site, which Sterling didn't do. Sterling didn't do. He farmed that out to a colleague, Ted Cullinan. And Cullinan, not unlike what Grimshaw did with the bathroom tower, guts this initial rambling, kind of screwed up ad hoc building, and he adds a courtyard in the center space that becomes a way to get everywhere. He figures out a way to get all these units inside the building, and Banham, in his review, goes crazy for it. He's like, this is fantastic. And he's like, Cullinan doesn't get enough attention, Sterling gets all the attention, that's wrong, this is really brilliant. And really the reason that it's brilliant in Bannham's eyes is because it provides a sense of unity to what had been a fairly disunified building. And that central courtyard gives it a kind of convincing clarity that the building lacked. When Banham came to write about Sterling's work, he was a lot less enthusiastic, which I found to be another very big surprise. With Banham, the building has this kind of four square on top of these walls, can kind of come down and reconfigure that space in various ways. Banham, who had always been a gadget guy, he's like, this is so fussy and stupid. Like, why would you do that? It doesn't make any sense. He was not tickled by the giant radiators and the weird axial thing. He didn't think it was funny that those looked like pistons going up and that looked like a spring getting squished. He really didn't like this weird window washing robot that goes back and forth and has to telescope. And that you would think he would love all this stuff. And he really beats up on Sterling, somebody who he was generally always very positive about in his writings. It's like Sterling is kind of, he's entertaining himself. This is just the wrong way to go. So once again, we see Banham, who I had expected to be the poster child of this attitude, not doing it. By this time, we get this mode is really kind of taken off, particularly in America. We'll see that in something like Graves or Waffy, this guy, this guy, who you may be familiar with, that thing. So it really has kind of picked up steam and taken off. Banham just doesn't talk about it, and actually goes in a very different direction. And so 1969, Banham's star student, Charles Jenks, gets together with his pal, George Baird, and they put out this book, fantastically interesting. And this is them saying modernism is exhausted, it's out of gas, there's no more life left in it, we need to do something else. And the something else that they propose is basically shifting the paradigm of architecture from technology to language. Architecture becomes about communication. Every one of the essays collected in the book goes bananas citing Claude Lévi-Strauss. This is the book that introduced sub-Saharan African vernaculars to the vocabulary of contemporary architecture. This is the book that really became the opening salvo in postmodernism. But of course, Jenks at the time was writing his dissertation under Banham, so he invites Banham to write an essay, and Banham says, everybody in this book's got it wrong. What we need is, it's really great, the way that he sort of takes everybody out. But his contribution, a very famous essay called "A Home is Not a House," where he makes the argument that with the right technology, you don't need buildings at all. You can simply get your stereo and minibar and all the other stuff that you need, and air condition a bubble, and you can kind of put it in. And he sees this as a particularly American attitude. The idea that in America, Americans don't seem particularly interested in monumental architecture. They'll sort of put up a chimney, lean a shack against it, and hang out on the porch. And so Banham saw that that was really good, and now that we had technology to make better chimneys that could make ice cubes and cocktails and keep the air conditioning and all that other stuff, we could dispense with the house altogether. And this was the proposal that he made, that we could just kind of go off and do something else. And so what happens here is that architecture kind of just gets sucked out of the equation, and what's left behind is an interior environment and the landscape. So Banham, you just like go out into the woods and you set this thing up and you take off your clothes and hang out. And it's great. And this article, A Home is Not His House, had exactly the same structure as this book, which was his most aggressive move in support of technology. And in this book, he also, architecture doesn't pay any mind to anything but structure and style. And the only thing, modern architecture in particular, is only possible because of air conditioning, plumbing, and electric lighting. And if we don't take that seriously, we're never really going to understand what modernism is and what it can do. There's a lot to the book. I'm not going to go into it, but I do want to talk about one very clever thing that he does in the article and also does in the book. So the articles are always a kind of template for the books that he eventually writes. He talks about Philip Johnson's glass house. And you would expect this to be seen as, and this is how he starts, as a kind of, this is the beginning of, this is totally orthodox modernism. And he looks at it, he's like, but what it actually is the erasure of architecture. All you get is, because of the heated floor slab, because of the siding, because of the way he uses these trees as a kind of vegetal brise-soleil. So in the summer, they block the sun with their leaves when the sun is up, but in the winter, when the sun is low, the leaves are gone, the sun can come inside. The building is all landscape and interiors, and the architecture really disappears. So in a sense, the glass house becomes the answer to the kind of kooky environment, the sort of evaporation of architecture into its neighbor disciplines. Banham from there is very quickly off into Los Angeles, the desert, and the kind of fame that he's come into. But all the while, he's writing about high-tech. And the high-tech buildings that, high-tech really starts with these two buildings. The history of high-tech really doesn't get written until the 80s. But these two buildings are generally seen as the beginning. We already know Banham didn't write about the bathroom tower, but he really loved Reliance Controls, which this was the first project by Richard Rogers and Norman Foster. They had a small practice together. Banham loved he loved the clarity of the details. He loved the precision of the construction. He was totally okay with the little homo wink to the Smithsons in this water tower that they put on the front. He was okay that these X braces were not required structurally and that they were there only for visual purposes. He really liked this building. And he really liked Foster. And Foster he saw as a purveyor of what he called appropriate tech. So a building like the Sainsbury Center had exactly the right amount of technology to put art in the world, and the building got out of the way as much as possible. I also noticed it looks a lot like CCD, which I didn't notice as much of the slide there. And I didn't notice at the time of CCD. So Banham really liked this appropriate tech, but he felt that architecture needs monumentality. It needs to be able to make a bolder statement from time to time. And for that, he saw the Conference Center as really the answer. This is a building that he quite liked. He had a few reservations about it. But this was Banham's portrait of what modernism should be. So postmodernism was attempting to kind of get rid of modernism and do something else. Banham posits high tech as the thing that can keep modernism going. And the way to get it to go for Banham was to kind of rewrite its history. And the initial history of modernism, which Banham lays out in his book, and we've all read these things, comes primarily from these two books, and one other, International Style. But in Gideon's Found in Frankreich, you get a vision of modernism that traces its lineage back to basically oh wait, I moved this part. Forget I said that. I'm going to talk about that. I should really pay attention to my script. Banham sees high-tech as a kind of rewriting of this modern history. This one that comes from tectonics, steel, reinforced concrete, and glass. This one that comes from style, Art Nouveau, Victorian engineering, and arts and crafts. So Pesner's version is style, Gideon's version is tectonics. Banham rejects his teacher and goes with Gideon and sees modernism as about tectonics. And he sees buildings like this, the traveling exhibition, as the answer. Here we see Banham kind of refining his position. When he began looking at brutalism, the concept that he wanted to advance, he called une architecture autre, an other architecture, which was not the architecture of the establishment and tradition and classicism and all that stuff, but one that was much tougher. At this point, he modifies that ever so slightly, and he starts talking about what he calls an other tradition in modernism, where what we need is to kind of refine modernism's principles, not throw it out and start. And the way that he proposes to do that is by looking at people like Gannon, who takes seriously the putting together the building. Banham's other concept, which I don't really have time to get too far into, which is, I expect to be yelled at for after the lecture. But Banham's concept for this he calls making art. That the point of architecture is making architecture, that's the title of the book. And making architecture has to do with solving problems within the canon. So we all probably are familiar with the famous closing lines of Banham's first book, Theory of Design in the First Machine Age, where he says, if an architect is going to run with technology, he realizes that he's running with a very fast crowd, and in order to keep up, he may have to divest himself. Like the futurists, he may have to dump his whole cultural load, including those garments that identify him as an architect. If he chooses not to do this, he may find the technology has gone out without him. The modernists made that decision by accident, and if we of the second machine age are going to do it differently, you better pay. And here, it's quite different. He's less interested in this idea of throw out architecture and do some other mode of design that makes more sense. But rather, he's saying, we're going to work within, we're going to solve the problems that come our way within the canon of architecture. We're going to pay attention to the image, right? So, in spite of the unhouse and in spite of Johnson, the image is very important, and also the details. And so, the details on piano's traveling pavilion, super fussy and ardent, exactly the stuff that he didn't like about Kant at Yale. And now this becomes the locus of all that is poetic and specific about this. So it's a very interesting changing of his tune that goes through there. And so once again in that book, so Banham was writing this book, there's an outline, in the archive there is an outline, there is some correspondence with the publisher, don't read it, and there is an introduction, a draft introduction to the book, and my pitch is that I'm going to use that as an appendix to the book, so that's, I hope they pick it up just for that, and I can shove my stuff in the back, and it'll work out. But in that introduction, he gives us yet another triple recipe for what constitutes, in this case, high tech. And so he gives it to you in terms of Alfred Barr. So Alfred Barr, in his introduction to international style, boils down orthodox international style modernism with three principles. So it's planar volumes, regular massing, and blank surfaces. Actually, he expands that a little bit, but this is the kind of core of his definition. And you see, Banham responds directly to the international style, who is the bad guy in his book. And he says, what high tech is about is the other traditions lands not in this kind of aesthetic mode, but rather in exposed structure, exposed surfaces, and bold colors. In other words, something like this. The inmost building, again, a little bit cooler in the early versions, but you put all the guts up on the roof where you can see them, and hang the roof from this ship-like rigging. And this was what high tech was about, according to those principles. But Banham had a problem, what he called paradox. that didn't conform to any of these altogether. That there was a whole bunch of buildings like this, which had no exposed structure, used drop ceilings to hide all of the surfaces. There was no color. And if you notice, and it's really a very exaggerated photograph, the building kind of vanishes, and what you're left with is interiors and exteriors. And so Banham looked at this, he said this was the opposite case. That high tech was paradoxical because it was both these monumental principles and this move towards invisibility, which was a dialectic that Banham was really wrestling with throughout his entire career. And the high tech book was supposed to, it seemed aimed to resolve it. So this is summer 1987. Banham was diagnosed with cancer and dies in March. So the book is never completed. The introduction was never published. And Banham's late career entanglements with disciplinarity don't really get a ton of attention. But if we look at some of his late writings, we can start to get a feel for just how far he was willing to move. The last book that he published, the only monograph he ever did, was on Ron Herman, the Archigram member responsible for the Walking City. Herman, through the 70s, when he was working on his own, was doing these really great like mashup schemes for the suburban sets, which was literally a set in front, and he was put all this stuff behind it. He was still making these great kind of Archigram collages. The telecom slug, which I think is a fantastic building. This was a moving thing. He would like pour a slab somewhere, and then this stuff would all show up, and they would build it. Here's my pitch at multiple ontologies. This was a building that, in order for it to work and travel around, they needed to have multiple pieces of everything. So while one slug was up being used somewhere, a bunch of pieces were somewhere else being put together. And so the thing would kind of leapfrog around the country. It was meant to leapfrog around the country. In what Banham described it as, so one slug wasn't enough. It may be 2 or 3 in some vulgar fraction slug required to make the slug operate. And you notice it's like there's the inflatable stuff. There's this totally, it turns out, structurally unnecessary steel that the building department made him include as sort of belt and suspenders. But Banham celebrated not that, but rather talked about what made Herman a consummate architect, operating at exactly the center of the discipline in Banham's arguments, was his attention to detail and the images that he did. And so Herman is put forward as the sort of quintessential architect, not the sort of Archigram renegade, but as occupying exactly the center of the field, which seems strange. Another essay that was published posthumously, actually, Banham was invited to contribute a catalog of the Blueprints for Modern Living exhibition in 1988. It was about the case study house program. Banham had always been a big fan of the Eameses going back to the 1950s. And his contribution to that book was called Klarheit, Ehrlichkeit, Einfachheit, and Wit too, which Banham translated incorrectly as clarity, honesty, and unity, which Einfachheit is actually simplicity. So Banham, I think he cheated on purpose to kind of make it seem more unified than he did. His German wasn't awesome, and he did make some mistakes there. But these were Banham's principles, that modernism. So now he's moving out to modernism globally as opposed to just high tech. The triple principles now are clarity, honesty, and unity. And here we see Banham really making this case for modernism. And the case that I want to make is that what we get is sort of 4 versions of how to understand it. We get Bars, which is basically aesthetic. Hevster's, which is basically sees modernism in terms of style. Gideon in terms of tectonic. And then Banham returning to the ethical position that he had advanced at the beginning of his career with the Brutalism. And so this was really where Banham was at the end. And here clearly Banham is speaking as much to other historians as he is to architects. He had just been named the solo professor at NYU. Post he was never allowed to, he couldn't assume he died. But Banham was really much closer to a kind of conventional history than you might think. The final text that Banham published, another really fantastic thing that you all should immediately after the lecture go to the library and read, was called A Black Box, The Secret Profession of Architecture. And in that, he wrote it on his deathbed. He knew this was it. And in this text, you see Banham, he's like, I'm going to finally try to figure out what architecture is. And this is my last shot at it, so here goes. And he begins by saying, Christopher Wren, not an architect. Foxmore, yes. Wren, no. Postmodernism, not architecture. It is in fact building and drag. So the whole essay, in fact, is a series of exclusions. Throw out all the cool stuff that I've been going on and on about for the past 35 years, because that's not architecture either. And let's look at what this thing called architecture is. This is what he's doing in the last essay. And he gets to, why do we not admit it? What distinguishes architecture is not what is done, since on the good days all the world is white and better, but how. So Banham again says, like, there's all these other modes of design out there. They're probably not architecture, and that's okay. And what architecture is drawing. And as he laid it out in the paragraph, disegno, a specific kind of drawing that comes out of Renaissance Italy. So from that, he says, he gives you more exclusions. So given this very tight definition of architecture, we get rid of all European vernaculars, get rid of the Gothic, and get rid of high tech. And what is left behind is a very classical definition. Architecture is for masonry, it's held together by graphics, and volumes are effectively closed. And then it dies. And this seems to be us. There's a little more. There's a little bit. I'm doing okay. I was just waiting that. But I saw this. This seemed very weird to me. If you look at Banham's writings closely, every book has a tragic ending. Every single one of them. So in Theory and Design, it ends with, we may have to give up on architecture. We have to kill it to save it. At the end of Brutalism, a promising ethic that is dissolved into a stupid aesthetic. At the end of The Well-Tempered Environment, he complains in the second edition that this was supposed to be a history of architecture and all the libraries filed it under technology. And nobody heard what I was trying to say. The megastructure book, and they all end tragically. And so as I was writing this dissertation and coming to the I said, oh man, I got like a really bad ending on my hands. Like Renzo piano turns out to be the answer. And you know, if you're from LA, you don't want that. Hopefully, if you're in Columbus, you don't want that to be the answer either. And so I wanted to figure out a way. Like I thought there might be another way. And so I wanted to show just one more building, and then I'll be done, and you can clap or boom, or whatever you want to do. But the thing is, like, I'm not such a huge fan of the monumental high-tech of I kind of dig the appropriate attack of things like Sainsbury, but it also seems that like, it doesn't have the kind of pop and punch, and frankly, the history that I like to see. And so I think there needs to be something more. The building that I found that Banham wrote about a little bit and always liked and never fit any categories was Foster's Will Stater building in Ipswich, which is super weird. There's this incredible kind of pragmatism in the way that it's made. So it's in you know, this city in south of London, plugged into this urban fabric. And Foster just like multiplies this sort of soggy, lobby shape of the site, 3 floors, puts grass on the roof, and then the little pavilion on the top is the cafeteria. He develops, this was actually the first frameless glass curtain wall. So he worked with Pilkington to come up with a way to get all the structure off the exterior of the building. So by day, you get this kind of really cool Darth Vader looking thing on one side, and by night, you get this transparent building. But mostly what you get are reflections, which are supposed to be there or not. Then you get reflections of all the historical buildings around. So you get exactly this kind of weird juxtaposition. On the roof, you get a park, or an English garden, more specifically, even with a ha-ha at the edge. So you get up to the top and you realize it looks like you've come up 3 floors and you found yourself exactly where you started, which I think is pretty great. So here's how that works in section. There's a swimming pool down below, which seems good. Really, a fantastically clever building. Super fun to look at just for its kind of technical aspects, which are mostly what people look at for. So when you read about Ipswich, it's all about the glass system and all the engineers congratulating each other about how smart they were. But it kind of misses other things about it. Here's some of those reflections, which Banham really kind of celebrates. So I like the idea that you get the kind of collisions that I started off in being interested in without the, in a very different kind of unexpected way. You get these green interiors, which are kind of cool. And also, it's a very strange building. It conforms quite happily with the Corbusier's 5 points. They're all there. It also conforms equally happily with Gordon Cullen's 40 points for the Townscape casebook. If you go through them, every single one of them happens at Ipswich, which is, I thought, kind of amazing. It does all of these. It's like happy to do everything, but it doesn't do any of these, except bold colors, but only as a veneer. So strangely enough, this building that Gannon quite liked, that he located in his opposite case, in his outline, actually doesn't do anything that Banham was advocating. And so I really like the way that it sort of flips what it's done. If you look at it, it's not clear, it's not honest, it's not unified. It's like obscure, dissimulating. Banham called it a nicely judged eclecticism, which would have been a really bad word for him in 1955. And it's not masonry, it's not compressive, it's not closed. By that definition, it may not be even architecture. That what it is, like so many of the buildings we looked at, is this kind of evaporation of the building into nothing but a kind of vast interior and the landscape. And so I'm not particularly concerned with whether or not it's architecture, but I really love the way that, first of all, this seems like a much better option than it seems to be a building that doesn't get as much attention as I think it should. And this is kind of where Banham's other tradition, I think, could go. And so, if in his work on high-tech, Banham seemed poised to reject the Pevsner line of style and get on board with the tectonic line of Gideon, well, let me just say this clearly. So monumental high-tech, the 2 versions of high-tech in the book, monumental high-tech begins with Gideon for Banham and Victorian engineering, and it moves forward through history, through constructivism, through Archigram, clip-on approach, to the canonical high-tech of the Todd Center and the Beacon. And that was Banham's other tradition. And there is also lurking in here, it never got written by Banham, but there is an other of the opposite case, which does all the things that Banham was against. It moves back from Foster at Ipswich via Pevsner through Townscape, which was off limits, the international style, which was off limits, 19th century eclecticism, which was off limits, and finally the picturesque. So it has all of the excluded genealogy. And these are all things that I've been quite interested in lately. And it was a surprise ending for me. And I just want to end by saying, in place of Banham's clarity, honesty, and unity, I think Ipswich points to a possibility of an architecture that celebrates complexity, invention, and diversity. And hopefully a little bit too, so we won't leave out all of Banham's things. And that's it. Thanks for listening.